The morning sun peeked through the windows of Metropolitan General Hospital as Nurse Chen arrived for her early shift, her comfortable shoes making soft squeaks against the freshly polished floor. After 15 years of service, she knew every corner of this hospital like the back of her hand. The familiar scent of coffee and disinfectant filled the air as she made her way to the nurse's station, greeting the night shift staff with a warm smile. Chen wasn't just any nurse. She had graduated top of her class, earned multiple certifications in critical care, and had even published research papers on patient care improvements. Her colleagues respected her expertise, and patients often requested her by name, touched by her gentle demeanor and thorough attention to detail. But something felt different this morning. There was a tension in the air, whispers among the staff about the new doctor who had transferred from a prestigious hospital across the country. Dr. Parker had arrived with an impressive resume and an air of superiority that made everyone walk on eggshells around him. As Chen organized her charts for morning rounds, she couldn't help but notice how Dr. Parker interacted with different staff members. He was all smiles and friendly banter with certain nurses, but his demeanor changed dramatically when speaking to others, particularly staff members of color. "Just keep your head down and do your job," Chen whispered to herself, a mantra her grandmother had taught her years ago. She had faced subtle discrimination before, but she never let it affect her work. Her patients came first, always. The morning progressed smoothly as Chen went about her duties. She checked on Mr. Thompson and 403 who was recovering from hip surgery, helped Mrs. Rodriguez with her physical therapy exercises, and made sure all her patients' charts were meticulously updated. Her attention to detail was legendary among the staff. She never missed a single vital sign or medication time. Around mid-morning, an elderly patient was admitted to room 412. He seemed quiet and unassuming, dressed in a worn sweater and carrying a small overnight bag. His name was Mr. Li, and he was scheduled for a routine procedure the next day. What caught Chen's attention wasn't his modest appearance, but rather his keen, observant eyes that seemed to take in everything happening around him. As Chen helped settle Mr. Li into his room, she noticed how he watched the hospital staff's interactions with genuine interest. He asked thoughtful questions about hospital procedures and seemed particularly interested in how different staff members worked together. Just as Chen was finishing up Mr. Li's admission paperwork, Dr. Parker appeared in the doorway. The atmosphere in the room immediately shifted. Chen could feel her shoulders tensing as she double-checked her documentation, knowing that the smallest mistake would give him an excuse to criticize her work. Little did anyone know that this ordinary-seeming morning would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would shake the very foundation of Metropolitan General's workplace culture. Mr. Li wasn't just another patient, and what was about to unfold would change lives forever, starting with what happened next in room 412. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as Chen took a deep breath, preparing herself for the morning's first interaction with Dr. Parker. She had no way of knowing that this particular morning would be different from all the others, and that the quiet patient in room 412 would turn out to be anything but ordinary. The morning took a sharp turn as Dr. Parker swept into room 412, his white coat perfectly pressed and his expensive leather shoes gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Chen was in the middle of explaining the call button system to Mr. Li when the doctor interrupted her mid-sentence. "Nurse, where is the updated chart?" Dr. Parker's voice carried through the room, sharp and cold. Chen reached for her tablet, but he cut her off before she could speak. No, I want the physical chart. You know I prefer paper records for my initial consultations." Chen politely explained that she had just finished entering the latest vitals into the digital system, following the hospital's new paperless initiative. The information was actually more current on the tablet than it would be on a printed chart. Dr. Parker's face darkened. "Listen carefully because I'm only going to say this once," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "When I ask for something, I expect it to be done exactly as I request. I don't need a nurse trying to teach me how to do my job." The room fell silent. Mr. Lee shifted slightly in his bed, his eyes moving between Chen and the doctor like he was watching a tennis match. Chen felt her cheeks burning, but she kept her expression professional, years of experience helping her maintain her composure. Perhaps, Dr. Parker continued, loud enough for patients in neighboring rooms to hear, if you spent less time making excuses and more time following proper procedures, you wouldn't make these basic mistakes. I've worked at the top hospitals in this country, and I've never seen such incompetence. Chen's hands trembled slightly as she pulled up the patient's information on the tablet. She had dealt with difficult colleagues before, but this public humiliation was different. She could feel the sympathetic glances from a passing nurse's aide and hear the uncomfortable shuffle of feet from the doorway where other staff members had paused. I reviewed this patient's history myself, Dr. Parker announced, his voice getting louder. There's a notation about a penicillin allergy that wasn't highlighted in red. Do you understand how serious that could be? This is exactly why I need paper charts. Proper color coding could prevent fatal mistakes. What Dr. Parker didn't realize was that the digital system automatically flagged allergies with pop-up warnings, a system actually safer than paper charts. But Chen knew this wasn't about hospital procedures. She'd seen that look before, the one that suggested no explanation from her would ever be good enough. Mr. Lee cleared his throat softly. Doctor, he began, his voice quiet but somehow filling the room. I'd noticed the allergy warning appeared quite prominently when the nurse logged into my file. In fact, she specifically mentioned it to me during admission. Dr. Parker barely glanced at Mr. Lee. Sir, please don't concern yourself with hospital procedures. We have standards here that must be maintained. He turned back to Chen. I want a proper paper chart on my desk in 10 minutes. And make sure everything is color-coded correctly this time. As Chen left the room, she held her head high, though her heart was pounding. Behind her, she could hear Mr. Lee asking Dr. Parker more questions about hospital protocols, his tone innocently curious but somehow pointed. In the hallway, other staff members quickly found reasons to be busy, avoiding eye contact. They had all seen similar scenes play out over the past few weeks since Dr. Parker's arrival. Chen took a deep breath, remembering all the times her mother had told her that dignity wasn't about how others treated you, but how you carried yourself through difficult moments. What she didn't see was Mr. Lee reaching for his phone as soon as both she and Dr. Parker had left the room, his fingers moving quickly across the screen as he made detailed notes about what he had just witnessed. The quiet patient in room 412 had seen enough, and the wheels of justice were already beginning to turn. As the hospital settled into its afternoon routine, Mr. Lee sat in his bed with a thoughtful expression, his laptop balanced carefully on the adjustable table. To anyone passing by, he looked like any other patient catching up on emails. But the truth was far more significant. Mr. Lee was actually Robert Lee, chairman of the hospital board and one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the state. He had chosen to be admitted under his less formal name, requesting a regular room instead of the VIP suite usually reserved for board members. His routine procedure was real enough, but it had provided the perfect opportunity to observe the hospital's daily operations firsthand, something he'd been wanting to do for months after hearing whispers of problems. The incident with Chen and Dr. Parker this morning had confirmed his worst fears. As he typed detailed notes about what he'd witnessed, a gentle knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Chen, back with his afternoon medications. "How are you feeling, Mr. Lee?" she asked, her professional demeanor firmly back in place despite the morning's humiliation. This impressed him even more. Resilience under pressure was a rare quality. "Very well, thank you," he replied, watching as she carefully checked his wristband against the medication chart. "You know, I used to be a teacher before I retired," he said casually, testing a small lie to maintain his cover. "I've seen that kind of behavior before in staff meetings." Chen's hands paused for just a moment before continuing their work. "Sometimes people have bad days," she said diplomatically. "We all try to work together for the good of our patients." Mr. Lee noticed how she chose her words carefully, maintaining her professionalism even in the face of clear injustice. He watched as she went about her duties, noting how she double-checked everything despite her obvious expertise. Through the open door, he could see other staff members going about their work, some throwing concerned glances toward his room. Later that afternoon, he observed more interactions. Dr. Parker was all smiles with the light-haired nurse from the cardiac unit, but spoke sharply to the Filipino respiratory therapist. Each incident was carefully documented in Mr. Lee's growing file of notes. Between visits from hospital staff, Mr. Lee made several quiet phone calls. "Yes, I need all employment records from Metropolitan General for the past 5 years," he murmured into his phone. "And get me everything you can find about incidents at Northeast Memorial and City Central hospitals." He knew Dr. Parker had worked at both institutions before coming here. As evening approached, Mr. Lee received an email that made his eyebrows raise. There had been 3 separate complaints filed against Dr. Parker at his previous hospitals, all quietly resolved with transfers and sealed agreements. The pattern was clear as day to his experienced eye. Through his window, he could see Chen helping another patient in the room across the hall. She was showing infinite patience as she explained medication instructions to an elderly woman, even though it was clearly past the end of her shift. The contrast between her dedication and Dr. Parker's behavior couldn't have been clearer. Mr. Lee closed his laptop and leaned back against his pillows, his mind working through decades of legal experience. He had seen cases like this before: workplace discrimination hidden under the guise of maintaining standards or professional concerns. But this time, he was in a unique position to do something about it. Tomorrow would bring his minor procedure, and after that, things would start changing at Metropolitan General. But for now, he needed to maintain his cover and gather more evidence. He had learned long ago that the strongest cases were built on detailed documentation and irrefutable patterns of behavior. As night fell over the hospital, Mr. Lee could hear the shift change happening outside his door. He thought about Chen going home after her difficult day, probably preparing to face similar challenges tomorrow. Not for much longer, he whispered to himself, making one final note before settling in for the night. The next morning arrived at Metropolitan General with a buzz of activity. Mr. Lee woke early, his notebook already open on his bedside table. He had learned in his years as a civil rights attorney that the early hours often revealed the most telling behaviors, when people were tired and less guarded. Through his partially open door, he watched the night shift preparing to leave as the day shift arrived. The interactions were subtle but clear. Dr. Parker, who had started his rounds unusually early, spoke warmly to some staff members while completely ignoring others. His pattern of behavior was becoming increasingly obvious. "Good morning, Mr. Lee," called a young nurse with a thick accent, pushing a breakfast cart. Dr. Parker, who was nearby at the nurse's station, immediately turned around. "That's not how we address patients here," he snapped at her. "Your accent is too heavy. How can patients understand their care instructions if they can't understand you?" The nurse's face fell, her hands gripping the cart handle tightly. Mr. Lee watched as Chen, who had just arrived for her shift, stepped in smoothly. "I can help with breakfast distribution," she offered, trying to deflect attention from her colleague. But Dr. Parker wasn't finished. "Nurse Chen, this is exactly the problem. You're enabling poor performance. Both of you need to understand that this is a professional environment." His voice carried down the hallway, making other staff members duck their heads and hurry past. From his bed, Mr. Lee quietly pressed the record button on his phone, hidden beneath his blanket. This was the 4th incident he documented in less than 24 hours. Later that morning, he overheard Dr. Parker discussing patient cases with his team. The doctor's tone changed dramatically depending on who was speaking. When the resident from India tried to present a case, Dr. Parker interrupted constantly, questioning every detail. But when another resident presented a nearly identical case, the doctor was patient and encouraging. Mr. Lee noticed how the nursing staff had developed subtle warning systems. A quick tap on a counter meant Dr. Parker was approaching. A clipboard held a certain way signaled others to steer clear of an area. It was the kind of invisible language that developed when people had to protect themselves from daily discrimination. During lunch, he watched Chen helping a new nursing assistant learn the computer system. Despite everything that had happened, she took time to mentor others, showing them how to document properly and handle difficult situations professionally. "You'll face challenges here," he heard her say quietly to the younger staff member. "But remember why we're here. For the patients. Keep your head high and your work perfect." Mr. Lee's phone buzzed with more messages from his legal team. They'd uncovered a pattern at Dr. Parker's previous hospitals. Talented staff members, particularly minorities, transferring out or resigning shortly after his arrival. Exit interviews were vague, but the pattern was clear to an experienced eye. In the afternoon, he witnessed Dr. Parker criticizing a pharmacy technician's English pronunciation in front of patients. The technician, who had worked at the hospital for over a decade, maintained her composure, but Mr. Lee could see her hands shaking as she double-checked medication labels. Each incident added another piece to the puzzle. Mr. Lee had seen this kind of behavior throughout his career, discrimination hidden behind claims of maintaining standards or professional concerns. But it was rare to have such clear documentation, such an obvious pattern established in such a short time. As the day wound down, he heard Chen giving report to the night shift nurse. Her documentation was flawless, every detail covered. Even Dr. Parker, passing by with a scowl, couldn't find anything to criticize. Mr. Lee made one final note in his growing file. Staff maintaining exceptional standards despite hostile environment. Discrimination apparent in selective criticism and inconsistent standards. Tomorrow would bring his procedure, and after that, it would be time to reveal his true identity. But tonight, he had one more call to make, to the hospital's legal department, requesting all records of staff complaints and transfers over the past 3 months. The pieces were falling into place, and soon, very soon, things would change at Metropolitan General. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Mr. Lee's hospital room as he dove deeper into his investigation. His laptop displayed dozens of emails from his legal team, each one revealing another piece of Dr. Parker's troubling past. The pattern was more disturbing than he'd initially suspected. His phone buzzed with a message from his assistant at the law firm. Found something interesting at Northeast Memorial. 3 nurses filed complaints, all withdrawn suddenly before Dr. Parker's transfer. Sending documents now. Mr. Lee's eyes narrowed as he read through the attached files. The complaints were almost identical to what he was witnessing at Metropolitan General. Accusations of targeted criticism, public humiliation, and different standards for different staff members. But each complaint had vanished, replaced by transfer requests or quiet resignations. A soft knock interrupted his research. It was Chen, coming to check his vital signs before his procedure tomorrow. As she worked, Mr. Lee noticed something he hadn't seen before. A small notebook in her pocket where she documented everything before entering it into the computer system. Double-checking, always preparing for criticism. "You've been here a long time," Mr. Lee said casually, watching her reaction. "Must have seen many doctors come and go." Chen's hands paused briefly as she took his blood pressure. "Yes," she replied carefully. "Each one has their own way of doing things. We adapt." "Must be challenging sometimes," he pressed gently. "Adapting to different styles." She offered a polite smile, but said nothing more. However, her silence spoke volumes to Mr. Lee's experienced ears. He'd heard that kind of careful silence throughout his career, the voice of someone who had learned that speaking up often made things worse. Later that evening, more emails arrived. City Central Hospital had similar stories. Skilled minority staff members transferred or resigned within months of Dr. Parker's arrival. One nurse had filed a detailed complaint, but it had been buried under paperwork and procedural delays until she eventually quit. Mr. Lee's investigation revealed a clever pattern. Dr. Parker never put his discriminatory comments in writing. His criticisms always focused on professional standards or proper procedures. On paper, everything looked legitimate. But in person, the pattern was clear: constant criticism of minority staff while overlooking similar issues with others. Through his partially open door, Mr. Lee observed the evening shift change. He watched Dr. Parker praise a young blonde nurse for the same charting method he criticized Chen for using that morning. The double standard was blatant, but carefully maintained under the guise of personal preference. A call from his legal team brought more news. They'd found a former administrator from Northeast Memorial willing to talk. She says there were regular complaints, his assistant reported, but Dr. Parker always had explanations. Called it maintaining high standards. The hospital chose to transfer him rather than risk a messy investigation. Mr. Lee made careful notes, his years of legal experience helping him spot the patterns. Dr. Parker had moved from hospital to hospital, leaving a trail of damaged careers and broken spirits behind him. But he'd been clever, always staying just within the bounds of what could be explained away. As night fell, Mr. Lee reviewed his notes from the past 24 hours. He had witnessed 6 separate incidents of discriminatory behavior, all carefully documented with times, dates, and witnesses. Combined with the historical pattern from other hospitals, it painted a compelling picture. Tomorrow's procedure would be simple, just a routine checkup. But what would follow would be anything but routine. Mr. Lee thought about Chen, about the young nurse with the accent, about all the others he'd seen affected by Dr. Parker's behavior. Years of fighting workplace discrimination had taught him that timing was everything. He made one final note in his file. Pattern established. Historical evidence supports current observations. Time to act. Tomorrow would bring changes to Metropolitan General, and Dr. Parker would finally face the consequences of his actions. The morning of Mr. Lee's procedure dawned bright and clear. He had already changed into the standard hospital gown when Dr. Parker swept into the room for pre-surgery rounds, flanked by several residents. The doctor barely glanced at his patient file before launching into his usual commanding performance. "I trust everything has been properly prepared this time," Dr. Parker announced loudly, directing a pointed look at Chen, who stood quietly by the bedside computer. "We wouldn't want any more documentation errors like yesterday's." Mr. Lee sat up straighter in his bed, smoothing the hospital blanket across his lap. The moment he'd been waiting for had arrived. "Before we proceed, Doctor," he said calmly, "I'd like to discuss some observations I've made during my stay here." Dr. Parker's expression flickered with annoyance at the interruption. "Sir, we have a very tight schedule this morning. Any concerns can be addressed after the procedure." "I think now is the perfect time," Mr. Lee continued, his voice taking on the firm tone that had commanded countless courtrooms. "Particularly since it concerns your treatment of the hospital staff." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The residents exchanged uncertain glances, while Chen's fingers froze over the keyboard. Dr. Parker's professional smile remained fixed, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't know what you mean," Dr. Parker said stiffly. "I maintain the highest professional standards for all staff members." Mr. Lee reached for his laptop, opening it to reveal dozens of documented incidents. "That's interesting, Doctor, because I've observed quite different standards being applied to different staff members." He turned the screen slightly, showing a detailed spreadsheet of times, dates, and incidents. "I don't know who you think you are," Dr. Parker began, his voice rising, "but you're in no position to." "I think you'll find I'm in exactly the right position," Mr. Lee interrupted quietly. "As chairman of the hospital board and senior partner at Lee, Thompson, and Associates Civil Rights Law Firm, I believe I'm uniquely qualified to address workplace discrimination. The color drained from Dr. Parker's face. The residents behind him shifted uncomfortably, and one quickly stepped out of the room. Chen stood perfectly still, her eyes wide with surprise. I've spent the last 2 days documenting your interactions with staff members, Mr. Lee continued, his voice remaining calm but firm. I've also received some very interesting information about similar patterns at Northeast Memorial and City Central hospitals. Would you like to discuss those incidents as well? Dr. Parker's professional demeanor cracked completely. This is ridiculous. You can't possibly. I never. Everything I've done is about maintaining standards. Different standards for different staff members based on their race or national origin. Mr. Lee asked pointedly. That's not maintaining standards, doctor. That's discrimination, pure and simple. The silence in the room was deafening. Through the window, the morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital floor, marking the moment when everything changed at Metropolitan General. My procedure can wait, Mr. Lee announced, closing his laptop. I believe we have more urgent matters to discuss. Shall we take this conversation to the boardroom? He turned to Chen, who was still standing quietly by the computer. Nurse Chen, would you please contact the hospital's legal department and ask them to join us? And then I'd appreciate it if you would attend as well. Your testimony will be valuable. As Dr. Parker stood speechless, Mr. Lee slowly got up from his bed. You know, doctor, in my 30 years of fighting workplace discrimination, I've learned that the most dangerous prejudice isn't the loud, obvious kind. It's the quiet type, hidden behind professional language and double standards. But that makes it no less harmful to the people who face it every day. The hospital boardroom had never felt so tense. Late morning sunlight streamed through the large windows as board members filed in, their faces serious. Mr. Lee sat at the head of the table, still in his hospital gown, but somehow looking more authoritative than anyone else in the room. Dr. Parker sat stiffly in his chair, his earlier confidence completely vanished. The pile of evidence in front of Mr. Lee told a story that couldn't be explained away. Printed emails, documented incidents, and statements from previous hospitals all painted a clear picture of systematic discrimination. Let's review what we found, Mr. Lee began, his voice steady and clear. He pulled out a thick folder. In just 2 days, I personally witnessed 12 incidents of discriminatory behavior. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. The hospital's legal team shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Mr. Lee continued. At Northeast Memorial, 3 nurses filed complaints that mysteriously disappeared. At City Central, 5 staff members transferred or resigned within months of Dr. Parker's arrival. The pattern is impossible to ignore. Chen sat quietly near the end of the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Other staff members who had been called to testify waited outside, their presence a silent testament to the impact of Dr. Parker's actions. But sir, Dr. Parker interrupted, his voice shaking slightly. Everything I did was about maintaining proper standards. You can't possibly suggest. Let's talk about those standards, Mr. Lee cut in firmly. He pulled out his notes. Yesterday morning, you criticized Nurse Chen for using the digital charting system. That afternoon, you praised another nurse for doing exactly the same thing. Would you care to explain the difference? Dr. Parker's face reddened. That's not. I mean, the circumstances were different. Were they? Mr. Lee asked quietly. He turned to the board members. I have documented 17 similar incidents in just 48 hours. Same actions, different staff members, completely different responses from Dr. Parker. The head of Human Resources spoke up, her voice concerned. Mr. Lee, if what you're saying is true, this is a serious violation of our policies and values. It's more than that, Mr. Lee replied. It's a violation of federal law. But more importantly, it's a violation of human dignity. I've watched skilled professionals being humiliated, their confidence undermined, their careers threatened. all because of one person's prejudice. He turned back to Dr. Parker. Your previous hospitals chose to transfer you rather than address the problem. That ends today. The chief of medicine cleared his throat. Dr. Parker, effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full investigation. Please surrender your hospital ID and access cards. Dr. Parker's face went pale. You can't do this. I'll fight it. You'll what? Mr. Lee asked calmly. Countersue. Please do. I'd be happy to present this evidence in court. He patted the thick folder of documentation. I've spent my career fighting workplace discrimination. This case is one of the clearest I've ever seen. The room fell silent as Dr. Parker slowly placed his hospital ID on the table. His hands were shaking as he stood up, the weight of his actions finally catching up with him. As he walked toward the door, Mr. Lee spoke one last time. Doctor, I hope you'll use this time to reflect. Discrimination doesn't always wear an ugly face. Sometimes it hides behind authority and professional standards. But it's just as damaging, just as wrong, and just as illegal. After Dr. Parker left, Mr. Lee turned to the remaining board members. Now let's discuss how we're going to prevent this from happening again. I suggest we start with mandatory sensitivity training, clear reporting procedures, and a complete review of our hiring and supervision policies. Chen sat straighter in her chair, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. For the first time in months, the future at Metropolitan General looked brighter. Change was coming, and it was long overdue. 6 months had passed since the dramatic board meeting, and Metropolitan General Hospital felt like a different place. The hallways buzzed with a new energy as staff members moved about their duties with confidence and pride. The biggest change was visible in the monthly staff meetings, now held in the bright hospital cafeteria instead of the stuffy conference rooms. Today's meeting was special. They were celebrating the launch of the hospital's new mentorship program, spearheaded by Chen, who had recently been promoted to Director of Nursing. When I started here 15 years ago, Chen addressed the packed room, her voice clear and confident. I never imagined I'd be standing here today. But thanks to recent changes, we're building a hospital where everyone's voice matters. The crowd included faces from every department: nurses, technicians, doctors, and support staff. Among them sat Mr. Lee, who had become a regular visitor to the hospital, ensuring the new policies were more than just words on paper. The new Diversity and Inclusion Committee had transformed hospital policies. Clear reporting procedures were now in place, with protected channels for staff to voice concerns without fear of retaliation. Weekly training sessions helped staff recognize and address unconscious bias, while monthly reviews ensured fair treatment across all departments. Last week, Chen continued, one of our newer nurses caught a potentially serious medication error because she felt comfortable speaking up. That's the kind of environment we're building. One where everyone's input is valued, where experience matters more than appearances. In the front row, the young nurse with the accent who had once been criticized for her way of speaking now led the hospital's patient communication initiative. Her program, which celebrated the diverse languages spoken by the staff, had improved patient satisfaction scores dramatically. The changes weren't just on paper. Small study groups had formed naturally, where staff members shared their knowledge and experiences. The break room, once divided by invisible barriers, now buzzed with conversation in multiple languages as people shared lunches and stories. But our work isn't finished, Chen reminded everyone. Today we're launching our mentorship program. 20 experienced staff members have volunteered to mentor newcomers, sharing not just medical knowledge, but also the wisdom that comes from years of service. At the back of the room stood a familiar face, Dr. Parker. After his suspension and the investigation, he had undergone extensive sensitivity training and counseling. His return to the hospital had been conditional on completing these programs and demonstrating genuine change. Now he worked under Chen's supervision and, surprisingly, had become one of the strongest supporters of the new initiatives. I learned the hard way. Dr. Parker shared when it was his turn to speak. I thought I was upholding standards, but I was really just hiding my own prejudices. Working under Director Chen has taught me that true excellence comes from embracing different perspectives, not forcing everyone into the same mold. The afternoon continued with presentations from various departments showcasing their improvements. The pharmacy team demonstrated their new cross-training program. The emergency department shared statistics showing how their diverse staff had improved patient care. Each presentation reflected the hospital's transformation. As the meeting wound down, Mr. Lee watched from his seat with quiet satisfaction. The changes he'd helped initiate had taken root and grown into something more meaningful than he'd imagined. The hospital had become a model for other institutions, proving that addressing discrimination didn't just make moral sense. It improved patient care and staff performance. Chen ended the meeting with a simple but powerful message. Look around this room. Every face you see, every accent you hear, every different perspective represented. That's what makes Metropolitan General strong. We're not just treating patients, we're building a community where everyone can thrive. 1 year had passed since Mr. Lee's fateful hospital stay, and Metropolitan General had become a shining example of workplace equality in action. The morning light streamed through the windows of the newly renovated staff lounge, where Chen, now Executive Director of Hospital Operations, was hosting a special breakfast meeting. The room was packed with staff members from all departments, gathering to celebrate their hospital being named Healthcare Workplace of the Year by the State Medical Association. The award recognized not just their excellent patient care, but their groundbreaking approach to staff development and inclusive workplace practices. When I look around this room, Chen began, her voice carrying easily through the crowded space, I see more than colleagues. I see a family that's grown stronger through understanding and respect. She paused, smiling at the familiar faces. A year ago, some of us were afraid to speak up. Today, every voice in this hospital matters. The changes were visible everywhere. The hospital walls now display photographs of staff members past and present, celebrating the diverse faces that had shaped the institution. The daily schedule board listed staff members' names in their original spellings, complete with pronunciation guides, a small touch that showed respect for everyone's identity. Dr. Parker, who now headed the hospital's diversity training program, stood up to share his perspective. I was the problem, he admitted openly. But thanks to the patience and guidance of my colleagues, I learned to be part of the solution. His transformation had become a powerful teaching tool, showing that real change was possible when people were willing to learn and grow. The young nurse who had once been criticized for her accent was now leading international patient care conferences, teaching others how to bridge cultural and language gaps in healthcare. Her accent, once a target of criticism, had become one of her greatest assets in connecting with patients from diverse backgrounds. Mr. Lee, who attended as the guest of honor, watched with satisfaction as staff members shared their stories. The hospital's mentorship program had expanded to other healthcare facilities in the state. Their reporting system for workplace concerns had become a model for hospitals nationwide. But our proudest achievement, Chen continued, isn't the award or the recognition. It's what happens every day in our halls. She gestured to a small group of new nurses who had just completed their orientation. These new team members won't have to face the challenges we faced. They're joining a workplace where diversity is celebrated, where different perspectives make us stronger. The breakfast meeting turned into an impromptu sharing session. Staff members spoke about how the changes had affected their lives. A respiratory therapist described how she now felt confident making suggestions during rounds. A maintenance worker shared how the inclusive environment had encouraged him to enroll in medical technician courses. Dr. Parker, who had once been the symbol of discrimination, now worked seamlessly with staff from all backgrounds. His patients received the same high standard of care regardless of who assisted him, and his teaching sessions drew staff members from every department. As the meeting drew to a close, Mr. Lee stepped up to share a few words. 1 year ago, I came here as a patient to address a problem. Today, I come as a friend to celebrate a solution." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of people who had been part of that difficult journey. "You've proven that when we stand up against discrimination, when we choose respect over prejudice, everyone wins, staff and patients alike." The morning sun had risen fully now, filling the room with warm light. As staff members began heading back to their duties, there was a new spring in their steps. Metropolitan General had become more than just a workplace. It was a community where everyone could grow, contribute, and succeed regardless of their background. Chen watched them go, remembering the frightened nurse she had once been, always double-checking her work in fear of criticism. Now she stood tall, leading a new generation of healthcare professionals and building a better future. The changes they had made weren't just about fixing past wrongs. They were about creating a workplace where everyone could thrive.